today, as Professor Chad said, I'm going to talk a little bit about nuclear politics. I'll end with briefly discussing the most recent Iran nuclear deal, which is of course very much in the news. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about some basic assumptions about nuclear technology and the politics surrounding that technology. This picture, by the way, is people just casually watching some nuclear test explosions in 1951. I think it's a great photo of, it just encapsulates that early nuclear age. So let's move on to some of the puzzles that I'm interested in. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to 2010. And in 2010, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is pictured here, he's touring some nuclear facilities in Iran. He was the president of Iran at the time. So in 2010, he declared Iran as a nuclear state. And he did this in part because at that time, Iran had developed the capability to enrich uranium to 20%. I'll go back to uranium enrichment in a bit, but this particular declaration was a part of an ongoing diplomatic conflict, as some of you will remember, and also one that's going on right now. But particularly at this time, it was pretty divisive between the US and Iran over what Iran was doing with its nuclear program at the time. So in general, this sort of rhetoric was actually pretty common for the Iranian regime at the time. But this sort of declaration isn't just unique to so-called rogue regimes in nuclear politics. So for instance, in 2002, Ozawa Ichiro, who would go on to become the leader of the Liberal Party in Japan, said the following. So he said, "It would be easy for us to produce nuclear warheads. We can produce thousands of nuclear warheads overnight. We may have enough plutonium at nuclear power plants for 3,000 or 4,000 rounds." So this particular statement is puzzling and interesting to us, right? Because we don't necessarily think of Japan as a nuclear threat or even as a nuclear state, right? So these two statements put together should point us to the question of what is a nuclear state, right? These are the countries we usually think of conventionally when we think about nuclear politics, right? So we have the great powers, the US, UK, Russia, France, but then also the kind of problem states, the rogue states, right? We have North Korea, Iran, India, Iraq, of course, with all of the notions of WMD in Iraq around 2003. So these are the ones we conventionally think of. These are the countries that have had some capacity to build nuclear weapons since 1939. So these countries have had uranium reprocessing facilities since then. So already at this point, this starts to undermine some basic assumptions that we might have about nuclear politics, right? And in answering this question of what is a nuclear state, I would suggest to you that this isn't just a semantic question. It actually has deep political consequences. So let's start to talk about this question a little bit. So we can try to answer this from a material perspective, right? At its very base, nuclear technology is about nuclear fission. I'm not going to get into this too much, but basically it's the idea that, or it's the process of uranium atoms splitting and creating a chain reaction to create some energy or a force for a bomb. So our first observation is that nuclear energy, or nuclear technology, I should say, is dual use. It can be used for energy purposes or for weaponization purposes, right? So it has both civilian and military uses. So we see that there's already some conceptual and political ambiguities that are going on here. And one main ingredient, so to speak, in the process of building nuclear technology is highly enriched uranium. So you might have heard of uranium enrichment, right, as something that is sort of at the center of Iran's nuclear program, for instance. Uranium enrichment just basically refers to the process of getting usable uranium from sort of uranium that exists in nature for the process of nuclear fission, which I basically just talked about. And again, this is a sort of bare bones version of it. This is a highly technological process. So one thing we could possibly look at is the states that stockpile highly enriched uranium, right? So this might help us point to some states that, this might help us in kind of figuring out what we mean when we say a nuclear state. So of course, right at the top are the United States and Russia, because they have the two biggest nuclear weapons arsenals in the world. But then it starts to become a little bit more confusing, right? Because we see that states like Canada, Belarus, Belgium, Kazakhstan, Netherlands, Australia, all of these countries are sort of in that group of countries that are part of the sort of technological process. So a lot of this has to do with the fact that highly enriched uranium is used for a lot of different purposes. There's actually a growing field of nuclear medicine that uses highly enriched uranium, particularly in Canada, right? So again, we see here that a lot of different countries are involved in this process. This sort of moves us away from thinking just about Iran or North Korea when we think about nuclear politics, right? So one other way that states have tried to answer this question of what makes a nuclear state is through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This treaty was agreed upon in 1968, and it came into force in 1970. And what it does is it basically divides the world into nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Those two groups of states have widely different responsibilities under this treaty. Non-nuclear weapon states just have to not proliferate. That is sort of their main sort of responsibility or obligation. And nuclear weapon states have to, at some point, disarm, get rid of their nuclear weapons, right? So, and we know that this hasn't happened. So you might ask, so how does this treaty define a nuclear weapon state? So this treaty says, for the purposes of this treaty, a nuclear weapon state is one which has manufactured and exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device prior to January 1st, 1967. So this is already a political definition, right? We already see that some of the material conversations that we were having before are being undermined by this definition. And this treaty creates discrepancies because it only recognizes the US, UK, Russia, China, France as nuclear weapon states, and we know that there's actually 9 states in the world that have nuclear weapons. So that leaves those other states in sort of a legal limbo. And what it does is that it actually creates a lot of conflict because a lot of countries find this separation to be unfair and based in a problematic definition. So what I've done is talk a little bit about these material and political and legal ambiguities. What are the consequences of these ambiguities, right? What are the political consequences? So here I'm going to talk a little bit about Iran. And I think this is where it becomes important for us to think about what the consequences are in terms of the Iran nuclear deal. So in the midst of negotiations, President Obama always said that the deal was about verification and not about trust, right? So the idea here was that the terms of the deal can help us figure out and help us verify that Iran is not a nuclear state and will not be becoming a nuclear state at any close point of time. But given some of the previously mentioned ambiguities, it seems that trust actually plays a really big role when it comes to these deals. So President Obama himself seems to sort of be aware of the importance of trust. And so in 2015, in April 2015, this is a couple of months before the deal came through, He said, the truth is Iran has all these potential assets going for it, where if it was a responsible international player, if it did not engage in aggressive rhetoric against its neighbors, if it didn't express anti-Israel and anti-Jewish sentiment, if it maintained a military that was sufficient to protect itself, its resources, and its people, would be an extremely successful regional power, right? So clearly, he's implying that the deal is, in fact, about trust. And I think that that's true because the actual material verification of it is difficult because we don't know what exactly we are verifying. So trust actually plays a big part in this deal. So I would suggest that in policy and media, we often see that the debate is over whether or not the deal prevents Iran from becoming nuclear. But we should also take note of how the deal is meant to change the kind of actor that Iran represents in the world, and also what kind of actor it represents to the United States. So I think that the deal is doing much more than just material verification, and is also changing the terms on which the world engages with Iran. And this will continue to play out through the Trump administration as well. And we see that already with some of the conversations that have been happening through the Trump administration, that it is also about trust from their perspective as well. So ultimately, what I want to suggest is that whether or not Iran is seeking nuclear weapons is a difficult question and is based in intentions. And in nuclear politics, and I would say in global politics in general, intentions are a very tricky subject. One thing that I think we can be sure of is that Iran is seeking nuclear status, all of the status and identity that comes from being a nuclear state. So that is a little bit different than a question of material capacity. And kind of separating out some of the status concerns from the material capacity concerns is really important when we try to understand this deal and nuclear politics. Thank you.